I'm Doug Petcash. This week on Face the State, the battle of the maps. Republicans clash against each other. We're taking a look at what happens now. History may be changing. Ohio typically mirrors the U.S. in presidential elections, but that's changing. We'll talk about why. And this first weekend of Hispanic Heritage Month, we talk with the first Latina on the Columbus City Council, the impact she's having on her community. And good morning, everyone. I'm Doug Petcash. I'm the new anchor of Face the State, and I'm honored to take over this program that has had a long line of distinguished moderators. I came to Columbus from 10 TV's sister station in Boise, Idaho, where I hosted a similar politics, government, and public affairs show for 8 years. As the anchors before me, my goal is to bring you the latest news, information, and analysis on the issues that affect your lives, as well as interviews with Ohio's lawmakers and policymakers. But I'm also going to take opportunities to let you know what's going on in our communities and introduce you to the organizations and people who are making a difference or just doing interesting things. So I'd appreciate it if you'd join me over the coming weeks and hopefully years here on Face the State. Well, let's start with a topic we've been covering closely for a few years, a topic that affects how you are represented in the Ohio State House. I'm talking about redistricting. They say if at first, second, third, fourth, fifth you don't succeed, try again. Many had hoped the sixth time would be the charm, as the Ohio Redistricting Commission was set to get to work last week, drawing a fair map for state House and Senate districts. This is happening after the state Supreme Court ruled the last 5 maps unconstitutional because they unfairly gerrymandered in favor of Republicans. The 6th attempt, though, got off to a rough start.
Recess until 8 a.m. Friday morning. Thank you.
With the bang of a gavel, Governor Mike DeWine brought the Ohio Redistricting Commission meeting to a sudden end to the displeasure of many there, including the League of Women Voters, who've been pushing for fair legislative district maps.
I didn't know that the Ohio Redistricting Commission could be even more dysfunctional.
Republican Senate President Matt Huffman and House Speaker Jason Stephens were not able to agree on who should be the Republican co-chair on the commission. Without co-chairs, the commission cannot get to work.
I think we'd like to see it, as far as the Senate is concerned, we'd like to see the Senate have its opportunity to co-chair, given that the House was co-chairing the last time. But again, that's just our preference. The Speaker and the President are the ones who have to come up with the conclusion.
The 2 Democrats on the commission say they are ready to appoint their co-chair, but are waiting for Republicans to announce their choice so they can ensure balance on the commission.
Well, I think that this, again, speaks to how broken this process is and has become. I mean, we've had 16 months to get to this point and had several months before that, almost 6 months before that, actually longer than 6 months. So there really are no excuses here.
Secretary of State Frank LaRose set a September 22nd deadline to approve a new map to give time for possible legal challenges and public hearings. Now it's up in the air whether the commission can meet that deadline in an even tighter timeline.
We're certainly concerned because if they can't even pick co-chairs, how are they going to work together to create maps that uphold the Ohio Constitution and the rights of every Ohioan to have fair representation?
Now, after that happened on Wednesday, the governor had set a second meeting for Friday morning, but that was postponed as well because Republicans still cannot decide who will serve as co-chair. A new date has not been announced. University of Cincinnati political science professor Dr. David Nevin follows the goings-on at the State House very closely. I talked with him Thursday about the Republican impasse over leadership on the commission. First of all, what do you think about what happened this week with the Ohio Redistricting Commission and the fact that Republican leaders in the House and Senate were unable to agree on a co-chair for the ORC?
Well, you hear the phrase dumpster fire from time to time, and I think in this context, that wouldn't do this situation justice. You know, we've had now literally years for the Ohio Redistricting Commission to produce a legal map They haven't produced a single one. We've had years since, they first convened for them to just organize themselves, and they weren't even able to start the meeting. I mean, this gives ineptitude, a new meaning, a new definition, because the Ohio Redistricting Commission is really at the height of accomplishment in that field.
Secretary of State Frank LaRose set a September 22nd deadline to produce a map in order to give some time for legal challenges and public hearings. With what's happened this week so far and delaying the start of the meetings, do you think there's any chance of meeting that deadline?
It could be done. I mean, a group of fair-minded folks could sit down and draw a map fairly easily if they were trying to. The real question is, do they want to? Do they want to sit down? And of course, do they want to ever draw a fair map? I mean, one of the things that's really notable, of course, is in the last election, we had a filing deadline that was before the district lines were drawn. So candidates had to decide if they were running for the state legislature without knowing what kind of district they could possibly be running in. And that's the real shame in all this, that we're making it harder for people to just simply enter their name in and run for office. And that, that kind of barrier, that just deprives voters of choices.
Well, something's going to have to be done now that the maps have been declared unconstitutional 5 times. What do you see playing out perhaps on a timeline? Well,
one of the things that the commission did exceptionally well in the last round was run out the clock. The old football move, like in an Ohio State game, when you're up and you just run the ball a few times and try and burn clock. They burned clock on the process so that they could get to a point where nobody forced them to draw a new map. And that's why in 2022, Ohioans voted with maps that had been found unconstitutional, and why we had to have a second do-over primary. We voted, once, and then we had to come back in August and do it again. This commission, which is 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats, has shown itself willing to delay and deny and keep this thing going and make it as difficult as possible. And their inability to even start the meeting doesn't give us a lot of reason for optimism that they're going to do things any differently. The one thing we know in this process is one reform that worked was the limit on their ability to split towns and cities into pieces. That worked. That's why the congressional map got a little bit fairer in this election cycle than it was 10 years ago. But the rest of the reforms were, an abject failure.
So this whole process of redistricting can be a bit esoteric and, minute details in the drawing of these lines. But can you put it into words why this process is so important to Ohio voters and citizens?
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, redistricting is like, geography as taught by accountants. It sounds really boring. It sounds really abstract. But why it's important is it's every single issue you care about ultimately is touched by gerrymandering. It literally does not matter what your top concern is, what your, biggest thoughts are about Ohio. It's affected by gerrymandering. So, you look at polls and they show, for example, 90% of Ohioans would like to see universal background checks on gun purchases. And the Ohio legislature not only doesn't pursue that policy, it actually goes in the opposite direction and loosens gun laws. That's an example of gerrymandering at work, where because you've skewed the value of votes and you've made it easier for Republicans to win super majorities, in the legislature, they feel like they can do what they want without much accountability. And so it touches every concern of every single Ohioan. It sounds abstract and the lines are zigzagging and it's hard to follow. But what it really is, bottom line, is it's power. It's a way to exaggerate your power. And we've seen the Redistricting Commission, because it is majority Republican, exaggerate the power of Republicans.
Ohio's congressional maps will not be redrawn for the 2024 election. That's, of course, when the U.S. will decide whether President Joe Biden deserves a second term or if someone else should move into the White House. Today, we're now 415 days until that election day. Ahead, we explore whether Ohio is still the bellwether state it's always been, how we may vote in the election if history has something to say about it. And it's lawmakers versus the railroads. The Senate Select Committee weighs in on policy and rule changes some 7 months after the toxic East Palestine train crash, what they're looking to do moving forward. When it comes to the presidential election, Ohio voters almost always favor the winning candidate. It's happened in every election since 1896, except for 3 times, 1944, 1960, and in 2020, when Ohio voted for then incumbent Donald Trump. Could Ohio's long-standing history of being a bellwether state be just that, history? I'm joined this morning by Kyle Kondik, who has studied Ohio's history in presidential elections. He's currently the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. Kyle, thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start there. Is Ohio's history of being a bellwether state now just that, history?
I joked recently that I wrote a book in 2016 called The Bellwether about Ohio's history of often voting or almost always voting for the presidential winner and often or almost always voting very close to what the national popular vote was. But the book, quickly went from current events to history in 2016 as Ohio did vote for the winner, but it voted for Trump by 8 points. Trump lost the popular vote by 2 points. So that was like a 10-point difference, and that gap between how Ohio voted and how the nation voted only expanded in 2020. And so there are certain aspects of the kind of Donald Trump political realignment. It's been bad for Republicans in certain places, but it's been good for them in others. And the Midwest, broadly speaking, I think it's generally been good for them. And Ohio is really stands out in that regard.
You mentioned the Trump realignment. Can you talk more about that? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, basically what we've seen across the country is that the Trump kind of lost some voters in kind of affluent, kind of upscale, highly educated suburban places, and of course those sorts of places exist in Ohio. Like if you're in Central Ohio, like Upper Arlington, which used to be pretty Republican leaning and now really isn't anymore. But the trade-off there was that Trump did do better in particularly kind of smaller town, rural areas that are pretty heavily white. And also don't necessarily have particularly high levels of 4-year college attainment. And, there are lots of places across Ohio that sort of fit that description. And Trump either turned some really red places even redder. You can see that in like Northwest and Western Ohio. And also he took some places that maybe had been competitive in the past or even Democratic leaning, like the Youngstown, Warren area or certain parts of Eastern and Northern Ohio, and either made them purple or made them red. And just the trade-off in Ohio, again, with those different trends, it just really has been bad for Democrats and good for Republicans.
And so those are the trends you're talking about in what you call the collar counties, around the counties that are home to the 3 major metropolitan areas of Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland?
Yeah, look, when you look at some sort of suburban or exurban counties across the country, and I'm defining like collar counties as the counties that touch in Ohio the 3 big urban counties of Cuyahoga, Cleveland, Franklin, Columbus, and Hamilton, Cincinnati. In some places you've seen a consistent Democratic trend in those kinds of places in the Trump era. Well, in Ohio, a lot of those collar counties have actually gotten redder over the course of the time that Trump has been around running for president in 2016 and 2020. There are some positive signs, like for Democrats in like Delaware County, which historically is arguably the kind of the most Republican or one of the most Republican counties in Ohio. But Delaware has trended Democratic, but it still votes Republican for president. A couple other places in Southwest Ohio. But if you look at like Northeast Ohio and some of the counties that touch Cuyahoga County, a lot of those places have just gotten redder, and presidential elections going from Obama's last election in 2012 to 2016 and 2020. And so again, it's like easy to find a lot of negative signs for Democrats in the state. It's not that hard, or it's not that easy to find places, places where there have been positive trends for Democrats in the state. You balance it all out, and it just has sort of shifted the political center of gravity in the state in presidential elections and in other elections too, more toward the Republicans.
I don't know if you get into making predictions or not, but what are you expecting based on trends to see from Ohio voters in 2024?
Look, I think it'd be a surprise if the Republicans did not win the state for president. I think it probably would mean that something would have gone wrong for the presidential candidate for the Republican side, and the Democratic candidate, be it Joe Biden or someone else, is winning nationally, going away. I think probably the more interesting race in Ohio is Sherrod Brown's reelection race, which I think is really a toss-up. I think Brown probably will do better. He needs to do better, I think, than the Democratic presidential nominee in Ohio. It's just a question of how much better can he do. In this particular era we're in now, there's just much more of a correlation generally between presidential results and down ballot results for U.S. House and for U.S. Senate. And so it may be that a generation ago, Sherrod Brown would have been in better shape maybe than he is now. But I do still think it's there for Brown to potentially win. But again, he's going to need some people to split their tickets in all likelihood.
Kyle Kondik with the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. Thank you for your insight on this very interesting topic now as we wait and see what happens coming up in future elections.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Kyle. So we've been talking about Ohio's longstanding history of being a bellwether. But, really, what is bellwether? Where does that term come from in the first place? I was curious, so I looked it up on Merriam-Webster.com. First of all, it has nothing to do with the weather. The term first appeared in English way back in the 15th century. Merriam-Webster explains, since long ago, it has been common practice for shepherds to hang a bell around the neck of one sheep in their flock, thereby designating it the lead sheep. This animal was historically called the bellwether, a word formed by a combination of the Middle English words bell, meaning bell, like ring a bell, and wether, a noun that refers to a male sheep. It eventually followed that bellwether would come to refer to someone who takes initiative or who actively establishes a trend that is taken up by others. So, will Ohio once again be the lead sheep or just part of the flock when it comes to presidential elections? We'll find out. The next Republican presidential debate is next week, Wednesday, September 27th. At least 6 candidates appear to have qualified, including former President Donald Trump. If you remember, Trump did not take part in the first debate. It's unclear if that will happen this time around. Among those who have qualified, Mr. Trump's former Vice President, Mike Pence, and Ohio native and entrepreneur, Vivek Ramaswamy. This week, Ohio's Select Committee on Rail Safety approved its 132-page report. It's the product of months of investigation and testimony after the train derailment in East Palestine earlier this year. The committee is recommending the state test the soil for at least the next 2 decades. They also want increased monitoring of agricultural products coming out of the region. At the federal level, a form of the Railway Safety Act of 2023 has made it out of committee. It would strengthen regulations for railroads. Still ahead this morning, it is the start of Hispanic Heritage Month. There are several events today and throughout the next few weeks. Next, a conversation about the importance of the month from the first Latina member of the Columbus City Council. Across the country, cities are celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. Here in Columbus, City Hall this week was lit up to celebrate Latino Heritage Month. It started Friday and runs through mid-October. For the next several weeks, people here in Columbus are celebrating the histories, cultures, and contributions of Americans whose ancestors came from Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central and South America. Many of the events are sponsored by the city and are hosted by the Office of Councilmember Lourdes Barroso de Padilla and the Columbus Latino Heritage Month Committee. This morning, I want to welcome in the first Latina elected to the City Council, Lourdes Barroso de Padilla, to the Face the State desk. Good morning.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So what does it mean to you to be the first Latina on the City Council?
I mean, very few people will reach a time where you're the first of anything, right? And to be a groundbreaker. I mean, I think on many levels, you know, my parents are Cuban, and so to be in a place where democracy was literally stripped from them and to kind of come full circle and see their daughter quite literally be part of and leading the democratic process is emotional on a very personal level. And then I think, growing up in the city of Columbus, often being the only Latina, my parents came here in the 70s. My dad owned the first Latino food market here in the city of Columbus. And we're always very involved and integrated in the community. And so to now be more commonplace, right? To have businesses and restaurants, and to now have a city council member where other Latinos can see, especially Latina girls, can see someone to look up to.
I was going to ask if you see yourself as a role model or as an inspiration.
I certainly hope and strive to be a role model every day. I think, it was interesting. We were at an event last night. It was a women-centric event for Latinas, and we talked about, not seeing ourselves in the media, not seeing ourselves in the community. And I think, you always want to strive to be and do more. And I think especially for our kids whose parents have sacrificed so much to come here. They crossed an ocean or a desert. They're doing that for the betterment of their children. So when their children can see what they can become, that's an amazing responsibility and honor.
The Latino Heritage Festival and Parade was held yesterday, but there are other events coming up, and some of those are the Latino Policy Day on September 28th, Minority Business Certification event on October 15th, and a Latino art show coming up on October 13th. What will people be able to do, see, and get from these events? Sure.
So all of the events, we tried to hit on different sectors of the community, right? So the parade was about bringing pride and a sense of belonging. For the certification event, we've been working to remove barriers specifically for immigrant, migrant, and refugee businesses in the city of Columbus, and getting certification through the city, which opens up the doors of opportunities for business. We have a policy day where we'll talk about minors who cross the border on their own, and what does family unification look like, and what does support for those minors look like once they come to this country. And then the last piece is the art show, where it's really celebrating through the arts, both through mixed media and also performing arts, right? So we really tried to show all facets of the community and how we elevate and pour into them and remove barriers for all of those folks.
How big and vibrant is the Latino community here in Columbus?
Sure. So if you look at the region, the central Ohio region, and you took all of the Latinos, right, through central Ohio, and you put them in one area, we'd be roughly the size of Dayton. Okay. Right, so about 150,000 people. So that's pretty significant in terms of, we've actually, if you look at the amount of Latinos in the state of Ohio, from the 80s, we've actually tripled in size, and we're going to continue to grow.
We just have a few seconds left. How important is it to hold events like this now in its second year?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important for communities. They're choosing us as their place to live, right? When folks come to Columbus, immigrants, migrants, and refugees are the #1 factor behind our population growth. They add to our local economy, they add to our culture, they make this the kind of city that people want to come and be a part of. And so that's important to celebrate, elevate, and pour into.
Councilwoman, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank
Enjoy the next month, and best wishes on all the events.
I hope to see everyone out at one of the events throughout the month.
Sounds like a lot of good information and a lot of good fun, too.
Great. And be sure to follow us on Latino Heritage CBUS on all social media channels. And then we also have a website, LatinoHeritageCBUS.com.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
And thank you for joining me this morning on Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. Have a great rest of your Sunday. We'll see you back here next week.